Queens Public Library continues to celebrate its 125th anniversary. Don't forget to browse our book list and share your QPL story. For more information, visit qpl125.org. Begin 2022 with a library card. Get access to all of our materials, including books, ebooks, e-magazines, music, movies, and more. Our digital media options, which includes ebooks, music, and more, are available from anywhere with an internet connection. Try Hoopla, our new streaming service connecting you to movies, TV shows, and comics. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is on January 17th. To honor the civil rights icon, we have special programs and recommended reading. Visit queenslibrary.org to learn more and explore all of these opportunities.
Welcome to Queens Public Library's talk with Matthew Spector, the author of Always Crashing in the Same Car, on art, crisis, and Los Angeles, California. Charles Yu, author of Interior Chinatown, said, Spector has captured the LA I know, the one all around me and the one in my head, a city of invention and grit, surface and underbelly. I'm Brian Alessandro. For those of you who don't know me, I have written for Interview Magazine, Newsday, Penk, Huffington Post, and I recently adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel for Top Shelf Productions, which will be released this fall. Additionally, I co-edited an anthology of essays and interviews about William S. Burroughs, which will be published this summer. I am also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the literary journal, The New Engagement. Culture Connection, curated by Daniel Zaleski and now in its 8th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. Matthew Spector is an author of fiction, the novels American Dream Machine and That Summertime Sound, and the nonfiction books The Sting and The Golden Hour. He has also contributed to the New York Times, the Paris Review, The Believer, Tin House, Vogue, and GQ. He's a founding editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi.
Of course. Hi. So the title of your memoir, Always Crashing in the Same Car, is taken from a 1977 David Bowie song, correct? From the Low album?
Yeah, it is indeed.
Can you talk to us about that? Like how it came to inspire the naming of the book?
Yeah, it's interesting. Titles are so, they're strange for me in that usually I find them in the course of writing the book, and I will either find them fairly early or not at all, meaning that I will find myself getting to the end and kind of struggling to find a title. In this case, I found the title, I sold the book as a proposal, so I found the title before I had written the book. So in other words, I hadn't yet discovered the sort of, I'd outlined it, but I hadn't really found the textual resonances for it. And I knew that it would chime metaphorically with Tom McGuane's car crash, which I talk about a little bit in the book. And I knew too that the book was going to sort of draw heavily on kind of my own adolescent self, and probably the loneliest and sort of most vulnerable period of my adolescence was when I was 14 or 15, and when that particular record meant a lot to me. So I sort of hung the title on the book without kind of knowing if the book was actually going to be able to support it, or if it was actually going to suit or not. And the interesting thing is that of course the book being a book about LA, there's a lot of kind of vehicular motion and vehicular metaphor in it.
Mm.
So it's sort of stuck. The subtitle, on Art Crisis was sort of a byproduct of the marketing department's intercession, and probably a good idea, so people would know what they were getting into. But the title was there from the beginning.
Is it fair to say, because I guess the meaning of the song for Bowie, for the song, was this sort of idea of that we keep sort of making the same mistakes,
Making the same mistakes over and over and over. Yeah, exactly. That's certainly how I understood it. Although I think I may have read recently somewhere that there was also kind of a fairly literal, and not that he was involved in a car accident, but I think there was some reckless driving or something.
Very, very J.G. Ballard. Very,
Yeah.
very,
Yeah.
very.
He has that
Cronenberg.
lyric about going round and round the hotel garage or whatever, and I thought he probably did that. At Iggy Pop's instigation, right?
Yeah, more than
Yeah.
likely.
Yeah.
There's a book. I'm sure there's one already been written.
Yeah.
We'll collaborate maybe. Your book looks at Los Angeles and Hollywood as both an everyday reality that you grew up in, Santa Monica specifically, right? And as a place of illusions and heartbreak.
Yeah.
Can you give us a summary of the two and how you came to reconcile them the way you do?
Well, to what extent I've reconciled? I mean, I think the reconciling of those things is an ongoing project, and maybe not just for me. I mean, I think all of us are kind of grappling with reconciling the reality of our place or our situation and whatever illusions that we have around it. But I did grow up in LA. I first, when I was growing up there, I was very much under the impression, I knew I wanted to write from a young age, and I was under the impression that you couldn't really do that in LA. I mean, you could. Joan Didion seemed to manage it, but there weren't a lot of other examples around. I mean, if I had been older and more aware, I would have known that there were, and that they were abundant. But the mythology of LA is that this is a place that eats writers, and if you want to be a writer, like a real writer, or a writer of any seriousness at all, you have to get out. So which is what I did, and it wasn't until kind of I was much older, deep, kind of approaching middle age, that I thought, oh, not only is that not true, but I found myself interested in writing about it finally. Not just writing about Los Angeles and even about the movie business, which I think is a subject that mostly has resisted treatment or has loaned itself to a certain kind of treatment that I have spent a couple of books now kind of trying to rebel against or correct a little bit.
You said something that really struck me just now. You had to sort of leave LA to realize you didn't have to really leave LA to become a writer. So tell the viewers where you went and what that epiphany was like and when it happened.
I went east to school, right? I mean, that was the sort of model was, and my initial thought was I wanted to go to Columbia. But Columbia was in the end, at the last minute, I thought, well, Columbia is a little too structured for me, so I went to Hampshire instead, which turned out to be an amazing place to study writing and literature. At that time, James Baldwin was still alive and teaching. Joseph Brodsky was at Mount Holyoke nearby, and he had just won the Nobel Prize. Like James Tate was at UMass. Like the writers who were in the area at that time were insane. Which is sort of an accident of fate. So I went there, and then I came back to California, but I didn't feel comfortable being in LA, so I moved to San Francisco for no discernible reason, except that it wasn't LA, and it was at that time kind of cheap and appealing, and I mean, it's insane to think of.
San Francisco was cheap once?
It was. It was sort of because it was immediate. This was sort of immediately pre-tech, so. It was an easy place, and I think I rented my first apartment there for like $180 a month or something. It was ludicrous.
Wow, unimaginable.
I'm not that, but it feels like I'm describing something from the 19th century or the 1950s.
All recent history, folks. Yeah.
And then I was offered a job in New York, a film job, which was sort of comical. Like I had been doing a little work in San Francisco for Francis Coppola, and
Wait, you have to tell us about that.
yeah, well, it wasn't. I mean, I was really just kind of like a script reader, just like kind of like a glorified grunt for his company, for American Zoetrope. But they called me one day and they were like, we would love to hire you. We're looking to hire somebody, and we want that person to go to New York. And I said, well, to do what? And they said, we want somebody to go and find things to adapt.
Wow.
The idea he had in mind was actually short stories, which was what evolved into. It was not yet the idea but it became the magazine. It became Zoetrope All Story. Right? He ultimately decided, I can have a magazine, but he at that time was just more interested in kind of finding things he could adapt.
It's a sweet gig.
Yeah, it was an incredible. And I realized, but they were kind of dragging their feet. They were like, well. It wasn't so much Francis; it was his lieutenant who was like, no, you're really smart. Your taste is really good. Like, who do you know in publishing? And I thought, well, not a soul, but if you give me a business card and a telephone, I can take care of that pretty quick.
Sure.
And then, I think as with a lot of things that Francis had, or just a lot of things that people have in mind in general, he didn't yet have the money, or didn't quite yet have the wherewithal, or the idea wasn't fully baked. So, but while he was deliberating, I thought, that's an amazing job. I didn't realize that job existed.
Right.
That's a job that I would be perfect for. So I made some calls, and I wound up going to work to do it instead for Robert De Niro for Tribeca.
For Tribeca, okay. Well, that's great.
That's how I kind of came to New York, and I spent several years there working. I worked for him. I worked for a company called Jersey Films, which was Danny DeVito's production company, who were really, really robust. I mean, they were doing Pulp Fiction and Aaron Brockovich and Get Shorty. That just like a really interesting run of very successful movies.
Were you with them during that period, or?
Yes, yeah, I was. And then for 20th Century Fox, and then when I realized I didn't, you kind of hit a ceiling where I was like, oh, if I'm going to keep working in this capacity in the movie business, I'm going to have to go to LA, which I didn't really want to do. So I quit. And then I was offered a chance to adapt a novel that I really loved, Shirley Hazard's The Transit of Venus, which is just such a masterpiece. So I wrote and sold my first script. And then I came back to LA, after I got married. And just because New York was suddenly expensive when I didn't have a bi-weekly paycheck from Rupert Murdoch to cash anymore.
Forgive my ignorance, was the script produced?
Very nearly several times, but it was not. But it wound up, launching, getting me other work.
Yes, certainly.
Things are want to do.
In your book, you wrote that failure is a pattern of mind, but also delicious.
Yeah.
How so? That's an incredible line.
I think that I think what I mean by that is that our narratives are kind of self-defeating narratives are very seductive. And I think that's kind of true for everybody. I mean, I don't mean to come across as, I'm not they're much more than seductive. They're damaging, and it's certainly not our own, it's not like, oh, it's your own fault. We're so in love with our kind of, traumas and despairs that I don't believe that at all. But I do believe that there is something about, failure that might be consoling if you've done it long enough. Might be, it doesn't, what's the metaphor that I use in the book? I think I liken it to surfing or skiing. It's like there's a
familiarity to it. Yeah. It's recognizable, and it's sort of the demon and can befriend on some level, maybe.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I prod at in this book in a bunch of different ways is that our mythologies of success, our dream of success is very different from the experience of success, which I think for most people, particularly public success, I think for most people, public success is very uncomfortable.
That's very fascinating to me. That's something I've always sort of been maybe ambivalent. My feelings have been quite ambivalent about. Because on the one hand, I think we all yearn for that. As an artist, as a writer, you want that level of recognition, certainly.
You do, yeah, of course. But you also, you want it, but it's, you know, it's not
Double-edged sword.
comfortable to arrive at it. I mean, I think for some people, in some transient way, it might be. Um, but I know a lot of writers for whom it isn't, and I think even the kind of moderate success of this book, which has been lovely, you know,
Yeah.
I'm cognizant of oh, you know, this is like there are aspects of this that are prodding me up against parts of myself that are not, you know, that might be less comfortable.
That's an interesting idea. That's an entire interview right there. Just looking at that one aspect, and we'll return to that certainly.
Yeah,
In your book, though, you also do a really great job of dissecting structures and dichotomies and myths,
yeah,
the great American novel, screenwriters versus novelists, West Coast versus East Coast. Joan Didion, of course, who just died in December
yes,
at the age of 87, was known for melding cultural criticism with memoir and especially looking with a very critical eye, sometimes jaundiced eye, at California, which is what you have done here. And
right.
you wrote about Play It As It Lays, her great novel as well. Can you
Yeah.
tell us how Didion might have influenced your work?
Sure. I mean, Didion, you know, was both a, um, you know, they were neighbors of my parents. I wouldn't say friends, but they were, you know, kind of very present.
She and John.
This is a kind of a point of embarrassing privilege, but you know, my parents and that household shared a housekeeper when I was young, so there was this weird sense of like, you know, my mom would be very occasionally on the phone with them, or you know, with Joan, or you know, and not just for logistical reasons or something.
Right.
So you know, and my mom was a writer, but not a successful one. Um,
Screenwriter,
yeah,
right?
screenwriter, and wanted to really, I think in her dreams, you know, she did write fiction in a very fledgling kind of way,
Mm.
and so I was presented with Joan Didion. You know, I think it was, you know, my mom gave me Play It As It Lays to read when I was quite young, and you know, and the White Album, and even when I was a teenager, and taking creative writing workshops at my high school, I was presented with the essay Why I Write.
Mhm.
You know, a very famous one. So, you know, Didion was really presented as, you know, not just an exemplar, but probably the exemplar of, you know, kind of how one might write about Los Angeles.
Sure.
Um, and I was both, you know, kind of dazzled by what she could do with form and with language, and I think a little bit resistant in ways, you know, early on. I mean, I think part of that was just because it was also coming from my parents. Anything that came from my parents was going to be met with a kind of
Resistance.
skepticism, or, you know, if you like this, mom, I can't get too close to this. Uh,
I get-
you know, so I think in many ways, my relationship with Didion has always been a little bit, you know, I mean, I think she's wonderful, but also there's some agonal aspects of it that might persist, and I think that's frankly healthy. It's a sign of a strong writer. You know,
Who doesn't just fall in love unabashedly, but is a little bit guarded and
yeah, yeah,
suspicious?
yes,
Yeah.
and
No, yeah.
I would also add that I think that it's been, you know, at that time the only available visions of Los Angeles, you know, as a literary prospect, right? As a thing that you would bring any kind of critical mind to, which I think one does with anything one wants to write about
Sure.
seriously, um, was as a place that was, um, you know, morally vacant, um, spiritually vacant,
Mm.
um, you know, cheap. I don't mean physically cheap, but kind of, you know, tawdry in some way. You know, it was the idea that this is not a place that serious writers can thrive. And Didion was in so many ways the, you know, at that time the one exception to prove the rule, right? And one can say that she didn't exactly write about Los Angeles with tremendous affection, uh,
No.
right? I mean, you know, she didn't write about most things with
It's
tremendous
tremendous affection. That's right.
affection was her
Right.
watchword. But you know, I was also, you know, I was both trying to see this place clearly, evaluate my relationship to it, um, and find a way to live in it, or at least to live with it.
Mhm.
And Didion's work was not offering me any of those things, which is fine. It offers many other things. But I think in some weird way, it was when I was able to read, when I discovered other writers a little older, when I discovered Eve Babbitt, when I discovered Steve Erickson, when I discovered Kate Braverman, even when I was able to reach back a little further and discover Chandler and Nathaniel West, people I kind of knew about but wasn't reading so early on, then it became a thing where I could kind of embrace Didion and experience her in a much richer kind of way, because I understood it wasn't the only way available to view this place.
To the point you made a little while ago about your mom having been a screenwriter and you sort of greeting some of the recommendations from your parents with a little bit of skepticism, and your father was a agent who co-founded Creative Artists Agency.
He wasn't one of the original partners, but he went over when it was a little, like, there were 5 guys who founded it, and my dad was kind of part of the little tiny next wave. I mean, I think when he went to work there initially, there were maybe 15 people working there, and that includes assistants.
It was a little intimate family, really.
Yeah, it was cozy, which is hilarious considering what
it's become. Yeah. What was it like then growing up with both parents essentially in the industry?
Again, interesting, because I think that it wasn't really until I left the house that my dad wasn't particularly successful. I mean, he was medium successful, but he wasn't he didn't represent any movie stars. He represented kind of working actors, character actors, and so there was a way in which the Hollywood that I knew when I was a child and a teenager was this kind of artistic middle class in a way, which has been bulldozed for the most part, right? I mean, I think it still exists, but it in a very different way. It doesn't exist much in the movies to speak of.
It's sort of like a great costume drama at this point when you you look back on that period.
And it doesn't, I might add, nor does it exist so much outside the movies, which is I think an interesting point too.
I think that's you spend a fair amount of time in the first chapter discussing and even dissecting F. Scott Fitzgerald and his decline in Hollywood, almost as a case study or cautionary tale. Can you say more about him and perhaps what he and his torment represent or are indicative of?
Sure. Although I want to just reframe that just a little bit, because the idea that Fitzgerald came to California and basically kind of fell apart is both accurate and not so accurate. I mean, yes, he came out here and wrote for the movies, not very well, and his kind of alcoholism and the things that were going to, kind of destroy him health-wise were already, in the process of doing just that. But he also came out here and wrote, the fragment of what I am absolutely convinced would have been his best novel, The Last Tycoon, which is a masterpiece. And I think, the reason I start with him, aside from the fact that, as kind of cliched and embarrassing as it is, he really was a kind of gateway drug to literature for me when I was, 15 years old. But also, because the stories that get told about him aren't, and more specifically about his time here, aren't entirely correct. One of them is that he didn't come out here to prostitute himself to the movies. He came out here because he really, really, really wanted to write for the movies. Sure. And in fact, the kind of the earliest draft of Tender is the Night, in the original draft of that, Dick Diver was a filmmaker. Like, it's crazy. Yes, there was some wish, some wish fulfillment, or I guess in his experience of coming here, wish unfulfillment going on. But then he came out here and started writing screenplays, and he wasn't good at writing screenplays. He was good at writing prose.
Exceedingly good at it.
Yeah. Mildly good at. He did get better as a screenwriter as he went on. I mean, I think it's something he probably could have conquered, but he didn't. I don't think he was as able to be as facile at it as, say, Faulkner, who actually made some good movies, right?
And he died young too, right? I mean, Fitzgerald was, what was it, 45?
44. Yeah.
To that point, you portray Hollywood as this place that can grant, and a lot of people do, a lot of people have in films and other books, and I kind of want to look at this idea of portraying Hollywood as this place that has the power to grant immortality and
Yeah.
allow the actualization of fantasies, even as it destroys you and constantly threatens to. It's
Right.
almost Lynchian, if I could be
Yes.
even,
I
or,
think
or,
so.
or reminiscent of Nathaniel West's Day of the Locust. You mentioned West a little while ago. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Um, well, I think just before we get into the Lynchian properties of it, which is a whole other, yeah, which is a kind of a live can of worms for me at the moment. But
I need to open it then.
I think, I think that the notion of Hollywood as a just as a sort of destroyer, right, is funny to me because it is obviously historically has been a place where writers can do something that writers always have a hard time doing, which is they can get paid, right?
Sure, sure.
That's what it's for. And in some sense, even though the kind of old model of like, the studios throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars at writers for novels and stuff, even though that has gone away, there are nonetheless a very large number of writers who are able to come out here and make some money, writing for Netflix, writing for Amazon, writing on, so that kind of persists. And I don't really think that has ever really been, I don't really think the movies are the place or the thing that kind of wrecks or problematizes writers. It's a, I mean, I think it's success, public facing and or material success that messes people up. And I think you look over your shoulder at certain writers in the 20th century who Truman Capote, Ralph Ellison,
Sure.
Harper Lee, right? People who had these kind of like, you know, world defining successes, and then struggled to keep producing, right? So I think I just want to kind of make that distinction between like Hollywood as a paralytic agent and success, because I think they're not the same thing. They
Well,
really
that's one of the things I really did appreciate about your book is that it's quite thoughtful. You look at these sort of tropes or cliches or stereotypes or truisms, and you do a really wonderful job of dissecting and questioning, and giving a fair amount of attention to either opposing side.
yeah,
You've also given a great deal of attention and thereby dignity to filmmakers and actors and writers and musicians who have been maybe a little bit overlooked or somewhat forgotten or maybe not discussed or screened or read as
right,
often as some more celebrated contemporaries
right.
whose careers have been aborted or abridged, as you
Yeah,
beautifully put it.
we've had experiences of periods of non-production or decline is probably the real question there.
That's a very poignant way of putting it. And maybe we could discuss each one as we review some of the photos that you sent us. So if we can get
Absolutely.
the slideshow up.
Yeah,
Okay, that's great. So Eleanor, let me just give a brief overview of each individual and you could speak to them.
sure.
Eleanor Perry, of course, she was the feminist screenwriter of Diary of a Mad Housewife, David and Lisa, and The Swimmer. And Frank Perry, her husband, was the director of David and Lisa, The Swimmer, and Diary of a Mad Housewoman, as well as Mommy Dearest.
Yeah. Um, Eleanor, and I love these two. The top image, I don't know where that's taken from, but the bottom image is quite wonderful. It's her on the set of her adaptation of John Cheever's The Swimmer, and she's talking to Burt Lancaster there, who's playing Nettie Merrill. Um, Eleanor, who was one of my favorite people to write about in the book because she was in so many ways, she was a wonderful, wonderful screenwriter, and I think in her heart of hearts probably wanted to be a novelist. At least, in the end, she wrote a novel, and then she was working on a second novel when she died. Um, and I could feel sort of chimes of that with kind of my own parents' narrative. But
Mhm.
Eleanor had married. She came out of the theater, or actually, she married when she was in New York. She married a theater director named Frank Perry, who was younger than she was. She was in Cleveland, and she had written a series of like successful suspense novels with her first husband, and then she took up with Frank, and they made a movie together, based on a case study. The movie was called David and Lisa. It was kind of um, a about a love story between two kind of emotionally disturbed young men and emotionally disturbed young woman. And they made this movie for nothing. They borrowed money from their friends and shot this movie, and then it went to, I think it was the Venice Film Festival, and Frank won a big award. It was like, they blew up on the strength of this independent movie, and then formed a creative team. And they're kind of Hollywood, so she would write and Frank would direct. And their Hollywood kind of experience was that that they that they didn't have another big hit until she adapted a novel called Diary of a Mad Housewife, which was an enormous popular success. One of those, the film adaptation of that was one of those things where, played for a year, and there were lines around the block in New York City for people waiting to see it. It's a fantastic movie, very, very of its period. But about a sort of young woman played by Carrie Snodgrass, who's married to an overbearing corporate lawyer who's just such an asshole. He's played by Richard Benjamin, and then she kind of winds up kind of getting seduced and having a fling with Frank Langella, who plays a playwright, a writer named George Prager, who is an even bigger asshole. And it's sort of, it's a very feminist movie. It's very deadpan. Carrie Snodgrass is absolutely phenomenal in it. So it's such a great picture.
Their era, Matthew, was mostly the 70s, right? Was it
late 60s, early 70s, and they split because they split, but they split when just as they were having this big success with Diary of a Mad Housewife, Frank, they were offered Play It As It Lays, which she did not like. Apparently, she did not like the novel, and funnily enough, I think that the sort of dislike flowed both ways, in that Didion did not like Diary of a Mad Housewife.
Right, I remember reading that.
But Frank wound up directing the film adaptation of Play It As It Lays, which we'll, I'm sure, get to later when we talk about Tuesday Weld. That's when their marriage fractured, and when her career kind of spiraled. I think, Frank, neither of them had huge successes after that, but I think Frank had a kind of another productive decade in Hollywood, and Eleanor was like, it's that weird thing that happens in creative partnerships sometimes, where it's like when they dissolve, somehow it's like one person has, people that somehow the industry might decide, oh, the talent was with this person,
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
They
or that person might be a better self-salesman. It's like, right. It's like
it's a marketable narrative on some level, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Right. I'm going to move on to the next two, which is Carol Eastman, the screenwriter of Five Easy Pieces, The Shooting, and The Fortune.
Yeah. Carol Eastman is one of the most unphotographed people in Hollywood history. So it took a little bit of digging to come up with this lovely photo of her as a young person. And in this picture, this would have probably been taken in maybe the early 60s, I think. Mm-hmm. She had kind of initially hatched as an actress and as dancer, but she was a screenwriter whose career got its start because she was taking an acting class at the house of a guy named Jeff Corey in Hollywood, which was sort of like the acting class. And Jack Nicholson and tons of people, Harry Dean Stanton, Dean Stockwell, Warren Oates, Robert Towne, lots of kind of Hollywood royalty kind of filtered through this class in the late 50s and early 60s. And she became very close with Jack Nicholson as friends. They were never in any other way involved. And she wound up writing Five Easy Pieces, which is the movie that broke Nicholson out, made him a huge star.
On the map, for sure.
Reaped a bunch of Academy Awards.
What year was that, Matt? Five Easy Pieces?
1970.
Yeah.
And then she wrote, she really didn't have very much that was produced. She wrote a movie called Puzzle of a Downfall Child for the director Jerry Schatzberg, which stars Faye Dunaway, which is actually really a great movie, but it's hard to see. It doesn't screen very often, and it's very, in a way, very Play It As It Lays like. It's sort of about a young model's kind of psychological deterioration. But then she wrote a movie for Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty called The Fortune, which Mike Nichols directed,
Right?
and it just didn't come out that well.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, it's. I mean, there are people who love that movie, and I kind of do, but I can't argue that it's a great movie. I don't,
Just
Yeah.
sort of in October, I just interviewed Mark Harris for this program. He just wrote the what is now considered the seminal biography of
yeah,
Mike Nichols, and
yeah,
he spoke about the film as well.
yeah,
And
yeah. But it's interesting because it's like there are people. The Coen brothers love that movie. They're always kind of championing it as this kind of underappreciated masterpiece. And I do think that there's stuff in it that's tremendously funny. It just doesn't come together. And I think it was just a matter of many talented people working together in a perfect creative disharmony. Nichols and Eastman, I think, had different ideas about what the movie should be like. There were endless attempts to kind of edit the script or edit the story in different ways.
in the case, isn't it? It's almost a miracle when everybody's on the same page and can connect and communicate and make a work of art.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's also a very the original title for that movie was I think it was called The Mousebed Heiress, and the reason is because the woman in the story is the heiress to a tampon fortune, and I just think like the Mousebed Heiress is just such a more interesting and deeply idiosyncratic title from a writer who was herself very idiosyncratic. And I think more than anyone in this book, other than McGuane, who's a thing of his, but I think an actual genius. I mean, I believe that Eastman's talent was enormous, and in her papers, which I was able to go through at the University of Austin, there was a folder of, I mean, I guess you'd have to call them prose poems or something like that, and they are so beautiful and so strange. They're like Hart Crane or like Wallace Stevens or something. They're so poetic and odd, that and for someone whose kind of public footprint was very small by design, I think, someone who really ultimately decided that she largely liked to be left alone. She left a kind of the residue of her talent and of her writing is so exceptional that I hope it receives kind of wider publication and distribution sometime soon because it's so good.
It's a great insight. Thank you, Matthew. The next is Thomas McGuane, the author of The Sporting Club, 92 in the Shade, and Panama, among many other novels, screenplays, nonfiction books.
Yeah. McGuane, who I love that photo on the bottom, which I write about in some detail in the book, is the jacket photo for his novel Panama, and it's I assume that he's on that little boat out in he lived in the Florida Keys. He lived in Key West. So that's probably a fishing boat. It's just, there's so much kind of the semiotics of that picture with its kind of like, handsome golden god, Jimmy Page, rock star novelist, floating around in his, what one can presume was an alcohol and cocaine haze. He was at that time had achieved a kind of fame that I think we've largely forgotten about for writers. He had been, and forgotten about maybe for good reason. There was a lot of, kind of like next Hemingway type mythology about him. And
as you were describing that image and the sort of from a critical theory standpoint, it almost felt like you were detailing the character study of a Hemingway short.
Yeah. His writing is nothing like Hemingway's. I think it was geography and a certain kind of masculinity that prompted the comparison, which was pretty persistent in those days. And to McGuane's enormous credit, you and I were talking before the program of about Edmund White and about how White is doing some of his best writing. And I really believe that McGuane, who's very much alive and lives in Montana now, is still producing just really wonderful, wonderful writing. I mean, he was one of my favorite people to write about because he survived the experience. The photograph, the top photograph, McGuane is on the left, on the far left. He's the tall one looking away from the camera. Next to him, Truman Capote. Next to Capote, Tennessee Williams. And I don't remember who the fourth fellow is, but they're at the wrap party for McGuane's adaptation of his movie 92 in the Shade. He kind of very famously had a car wreck in I think it was 1973 in Texas. He was driving a silver Porsche and he smashed it up at very high speed. Was hospitalized.
That's some of the best writing in the book, by the way. That sequence. I read it 3 times. I was stunned by it. It's gorgeous. Yeah.
He when he came out of the hospital, he was like, "Fuck this! I'm tired of kind of sitting in my room writing novels. Like I want to go to Hollywood and make some movies." And I'm sure obviously anybody can say I want to go to Hollywood and make some movies. There had to be the appetite for him to do it, which there was, because he sold and he made 3 movies. Wrote. Let me see. Wait, 92 in the Shade, Rancho Deluxe. He wrote 4 movies, directed 1 in the span of about a year and a half. There was The Sporting Club, Rancho Deluxe, 92 in the Shade, and Missouri Breaks, this kind of incredibly weird Western with Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson. And then he left. He was like, I gotta get out of here. And he went home and he wrote Panama, which was sort of his summation in some ways of his Hollywood experience, even though it's not about Hollywood. It's about a rock star who comes home to Key West. And the book was just excoriated. This was a guy who had sort of gotten, been critically celebrated, out the ears. And then he came home and it was like all over with this one book.
Did they find it sort of self-indulgent? What was the primary?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think is so strange is that it's. I don't think it's any more self-indulgent than the books that preceded it. I think actually McGuane is a writer who has gotten. I think his first novel, The Sporting Club, is pretty indulgent. I'm not wild about that. It's and then I think the 2 that followed it immediately thereafter, 92 in the Shade and The Bushwhack Piano, both great books. Both kind of high energy and very antic in this, again, I think in 1970, 1971, American prose, there was a lot of that. It was the era of Brodigan and Vonnegut, so there was or even people like Barry Hannah, right, wonderful, wonderful writer, but a kind of collision of like kind of the Southern Gothic. Right. I mean, I think there was probably more Flannery O'Connor in McGuane's work than there was Hemingway.
That's an interesting piece of criticism. I would love to look more at that.
Yeah, it hadn't occurred to me until just now, but I think it's quite true.
Write it down. Write an essay about that. That's a great.
So I think I think Panama, for whatever reason, I think maybe just because he was coming out of a period of prosperity and success, and wrote a book that kind of addressed that directly, then you had people sort of be like, what the fuck is this? Why are you, this isn't what we want from you.
Next, we have Tuesday Weld, the actress who played in Play It As It Lays, Looking for Mr. Goodbar and Once Upon a Time in America. Yes.
Tuesday Weld, incredible figure. And of these 2 stills, the bottom is a publicity shot of unknown vintage. The top one is a still from a movie called Pretty Poison, which is I think one of my favorites of her productions. It's a very kind of strange movie in which she plays opposite Tony Perkins, and so there's a little bit of play with the sort of Tony Perkins psycho persona, but as one might be able to ascertain from that top photo, Weld's character turns out to be considerably more devious than the person that we might assume is endangering her. Weld was, an actress who fascinated me. She's obviously surpassingly beautiful and came of age at a time when the movies were very uninclined to look very far beyond that. um, uh, and she was herself a sort of very um, she was not very interested in being a star, I think, which is kind of the great thing about it. She was sort of rose to popularity when she was still a teenager, on a television show called The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, and then was kind of fed into the starlet machine. It was like, oh, we'll cast her opposite Elvis. Like they gave her lots of shitty parts, and it wasn't until she it took about 10 years in the business before she even started to get serious parts. And then her choices were just, were strange. She's quite wonderful in the adaptation of Play It As It Lay. She plays Mariah Wyeth, and it's a weird adaptation because the book and the novel require a sort of anhedonic coldness, and Weld is so warm. She just has a kind of natural humaneness and brightness to her presence that I think doesn't it, I don't know that it undermines the movie, but it just creates a tone that is very unlike the tone of the book. It is nothing like the book.
What did Didion think of the adaptation? Did she not like it? Did I?
I don't know what her comment on it was. I mean, I don't. I think it was not a hit, so she didn't. My suspicion is whether or not she liked it, she certainly didn't feel any reason to be attached to it. I think she was able to just sort of, I'm sure if I did some digging, I could find out what she thought. I've never investigated, so I don't know. But I think Weld is I think the great thing about Tuesday Weld is that she is someone who had all the equipment and opportunities to be a sort of conventional leading lady, and no real interest in doing that. I think.
I thought that was really fascinating reading about
Yeah.
her in your book and how she was turning down some really kind of iconic
She turned
roles.
down
Which
Bonnie
movie?
and Clyde, right? Which made Faye Dunaway a star. She
Yeah.
turned down Cactus Flower. She turned down Pop, for which Goldie Hawn won an Oscar. She turned down Pop, Carol and Ted and Alice.
Didn't seem like she regretted any of her choices.
Didn't
She was
want
just sort of going with my gut. I think I like this. I don't like that. I'm doing this. I'm not doing that. And that's what it is.
She didn't want
Yeah.
and she did, and I think her kind of late roles, I talk some in the book about her performance in Michael Mann's Thief, where she plays opposite James Caan, and she's so good in it. It's and I think Caan has gone on record. There's a 10-minute scene that's set in a diner. It's just her and Caan's character, who is, as the movie's title implies, a thief, a professional safecracker who's gotten out of prison, and he's kind of, they're on a date, and he's kind of trying to describe, he's kind of trying to not so much seduce her as just convince her, and she's resisting. And it's such a beautiful scene. It's such a just sad, human scene, and the same with her part in Once Upon a Time in America, which I think is a masterpiece. She was very good later on in playing people who were broken or breaking or sad in some way.
I have to ask you the obvious question at this point, Matthew, that I don't think I really had a chance to ask yet. One half of your book is memoir, and the other half are these very affectionate case studies of these figures. Can you connect them for us? Maybe not on an individualized basis, but generally thematically.
Yeah.
What about inclusion?
Although what's interesting to me is that I didn't, it would never much occur to me to write a memoir that was just a memoir, like a confessional memoir. Even though the book that I'm writing now is also a memoir of a different kind, but this book, the personal narrative that grounds this is filled with what I would have to call ordinary pain, which is to say, losing experiences of losing a parent, divorce, professional disappointment. All stuff that I knew I wanted to saturate a narrative with without trying to have that be the narrative. I think that the time for a sad middle-aged white person memoirs is probably beyond us, and mercifully so. It just didn't. That didn't occur to me. So I thought, but I knew too that I was interested in writing criticism, as I always am. And I thought, well, if I could sublimate the personal narrative, if I could saturate the criticism with that, and if I could kind of weave these things together, and the thing that I think the book has managed, or so I'm told, is to make that experience somewhat seamless. I know that there are readers, I hear from readers who don't have any particular interest in Tuesday Weld or Hal Ashby, or whatever. I kind of had a moment where I thought, well, maybe this book is just going to attract people who are real kind of like Hollywood specialists, and which is great. I'm happy to hear from film enthusiasts, in this case, but that's not entirely who the book is for, or maybe even not at all who the book is for. And so, that was the kind of both the challenge and the delight of writing it, was just kind of the opportunity to weave these things together and make them consubstantial in some way, so that it's like, even if I'm writing about Eleanor Perry, I'm writing about, not just my disappointment, but my mom's disappointment, and the disappointments of, a kind of generation of women, right? Or if I'm writing about Tuesday Weld, am I, it's hopefully I'm not just writing about, this was an interesting chapter, Tuesday Weld, because I didn't want to be, writing about kind of fetishizing an actress. I want, right? Or, oh, this glamorous, marvelous, she is all these things, but it was much more about, who was she as an artist? What was the what was the struggle, and what were the rewards of being someone who was involved in Hollywood in that way at that time, right?
It's a tremendously novel and inventive and really thoughtful approach, and I have to commend you on it.
Yeah.
Warren Zevon, the musician behind Werewolves of London and Lawyers, Guns, and Money.
Yeah. By the way, I see a question in the sidebar about Hal Ashby, and we'll get to that when we get to Hal Ashby. Warren Zevon. Yeah. Again, this, I feel like as I wind a little deeper into the book, there is a way in which I was, when I started working on this book, I thought, I'll make a list of artists that I might want to write about. And the list was very long. And when I started winnowing it down, I was looking for, I started realizing, well, they shouldn't all be writers. They shouldn't all, it was like designing a tarot deck or something in some weird way. I wanted something different from each of them. And it just so happened that Zevon both fit the personal narrative, because I have had and still have a friend who had been his girlfriend for a time in the early 90s, and who was living upstairs from me during a certain period in the book, and also, as someone who obviously is not directly connected with the movies, but who I think brought a kind of self-consciously cinematic sense to his personality as a performer and to his songwriting, and who happened to be, particularly during the kind of like reckless and alcohol-fueled period of his life, not such a great guy. And I think I wanted to kind of also be able to brush up against that question of, what does it mean to really connect with the art of someone who was not wonderful? I mean, that's a very 21st century question, right?
Sure.
What do we do with our canceled people? And Warren has not been canceled, and I would hope that remains the case. But he certainly, by the testimony of his wife, Crystal, and such, there are plenty of stories about him that were problematic, and and I wanted to engage that again, not in a kind of unilateral way, but in a way that might have been more supple, and that might have, because there are also many quite wonderful stories about him. I mean, the people I know who were close to him were, very, very, very fond of him. you know, and not and for good reason.
Hal Ashby, the director of Harold and Maude, Shampoo, Being There, and Michael Cimino, the director of Deer Hunter, The Rose, and Heaven's Gate.
Yeah, I love these pictures of Hal, and particularly the one of him on the bottom with Ruth Gordon there, on which would be on the set of Harold and Maude, which is kind of amazing because Harold and Maude was 72, I think, 72 or 73. So he wasn't that old. I mean, I think he was older than most people in Hollywood because he'd had a kind of like 10-year apprenticeship as a film editor, but he's still probably only in his 40s, their early 40s, and he just looks, yeah,
He looks like 20 years older.
yeah. Well, he's got it's the white hair and the kind of heavy beard. Someone asked, did I ever meet Hal Ashby? And the answer is, yeah, but I was very young, too young really to remember it. My dad, who is still alive and still an agent, has a story where he talks about. I said, you know, I asked him not that long ago. I said, you know, oh, what did you think of Harold and Maude? And he said, I loved it. And he said, it's funny. I went to see it with your mom in Westwood, whatever theater it was, and you know, we were laughing through the whole thing. And I called Hal on Monday morning, and I said, I just want to tell you, I think you know, I think your movie's a masterpiece. I loved it so much. And he said, yeah, I know. And I said, how did you know? And Ashby said, because I was sitting right behind you on Friday night when you were watching the movie. So I think it's funny that he would have
paid attention and remember.
But I mean, you know, as for his legacy, I mean, he made 7 great movies in a row. 7 or is it 8? I'm suddenly losing track. But he had an incredible run. And then a period of at the end where he made 4 or 5 movies that weren't that great, but not very many directors have made 7 or 8 great movies at all, let alone consecutively. So I just place them as safe.
I had just revisited Being There this past fall, and it's what a masterpiece. I had also mentioned Michael Cimino a minute ago in the same breath.
Yes.
Here are the photos of him, and of course, Heaven's Gate, The Rose, Deer Hunter.
Yeah, Cimino is you know, the stories about him are very famous. He made The Deer Hunter, which, you know, netted however many Oscar nominations, a ton of them. And then which gave him the opportunity to go make a movie called Heaven's Gate. And at least, which I think was 1980, he made Heaven's Gate. And it was a debacle. It cost a fortune. It was wildly over budget, and it bankrupted United Artists, basically. Which is pretty amazing that a $40 million movie could bankrupt a movie studio back in the day, right? I mean, these days movie studios spend hundreds of millions of dollars on everything. You know, and then he had a period of both struggling to get movies made and advancing reclusion. And it's that period of reclusion that kind of interests me a little bit, which is, you know, I think he's another kind of problematic person in the book. I liked yoking him with Ashby because where Ashby was a real hippie. I mean, just a loving spirit. You know, had trouble with authority, but I think was just someone who just everybody loved him, except for the studio executives with whom he fought. Every actor, every crew member, he was wonderful. Cimino was ornery, and his politics were, I think, relatively right wing. You know, and he, you know, when he didn't retire, but you know, in the kind of later years of his life, when he was sort of not having trouble making movies and not going out a lot, there were kind of you know, speculations in the press, frankly, what I find rather transphobic speculations in the press about, you know, about his gender identity and what had become of him. And there's one piece in Vanity Fair from the early 2000s, a really interesting piece, where that kind of addresses that with him. It's an interview. It's a kind of long form interview / profile, and his dodging of that question, you know, is itself, he dodges it and deflects it in ways that are themselves both a little transphobic, but also sort of fascinating because they're indirect, and they he was someone who was never very straightforward about his biography. He was always sort of claiming that he'd been a medic in the military, been a Green Beret, and it was always like, well, really? Or he'd carry around a driver's license that had his date of birth as 10 years later than it actually was. There was a lot of kind of myth making and myth maintenance for him. But The Deer Hunter is a great movie, so there you have it.
And Renata Adler, the film critic for the New York Times in the late 60s. She was also a reporter for the New Yorker and the novelist of Speedboat and Pitch Dark.
Yeah.
Also, please talk a little bit about her takedown of Pauline Kael, which I thought was fabulous.
Yeah, I love this because Renata, who I feel comfortable calling Renata because I somewhat improbably and much to my delight and amazement have gotten to know her pretty well.
Sure.
She's I always knew I was going to end with her, and both because I knew that she had been involved with the movies, like I said, as a critic, but of course her work has never been adapted, and yet I think in my mind, she had always chimed in my mind with Joan Didion. She kind of and I think just as sort of a certain kind of literary celebrity in the 1970s and 1980s, I do think that she and Joan were on parallel or adjacent. I know they knew each other socially. I think they were both kind of evoked, both by my parents and by people in a similar way. She was briefly a film critic for a house critic for the New York Times in 1968. And there's a kind of collection of her reviews that, on the one hand is both the kind of book that doesn't need to exist anymore, or doesn't exist anymore, right? Where a major writer has their kind of minor arcana rounded up and published in book form just because of who they are. But it's very interesting because 1968, which is the year she was a critic, was like a huge watershed year for film. So it's very cool to kind of have someone who wasn't really a film critic responding to the cinema of that moment in real time, right? An incredibly sensitive instrument, and mostly getting it right. I think there are people who think she was a lousy film critic. I don't think that at all. I think she was a good one. But I don't remember what year the Pauline Kael review ran, but it was relatively late. I think it would have been in the 90s or maybe even early 2000s. She reviewed a collected, a collection of Pauline Kael's reviews, and 8,000 words. It was in the New York Review of Books, and it was an 8,000 word. I guess one really would have to call it a takedown. And I think in many ways the blowback from that has been even worse, because I think that people who are very devoted to Pauline Kael, who was a preternaturally gifted and great critic.
Oh yes.
But who I think had I think in the late, by the time she had done that for a while, I think it's very, very hard to remain a really gifted professional critic for a long time. I think, it just as it is to remain an artist. I think, I think that, even people like Anthony Lane or James Wood, who are still capable critics, might not quite have they might not, be as sharp or as startling as they were at the beginning. That's fair. So, this article in which Renata kind of wrote about Kael's work, first by saying, here is this critic that I grew up, discovered and began following devoutly, who has now produced this book that is, I think the first thing she says is utterly line by line, without interruption, something worthless. And then goes on to talk about it for several more thousand words, explaining why.
Almost like a doctoral dissertation, really.
Yeah, it's definitely a review that if I were a Pauline Kael, devotee and or Kael herself, might have found a little excessive. Yes.
To this point, what do people want from movies? You're right about how we're looking for the crisis.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you say more about that? And
Yeah.
we could
Well,
stop sharing now, Zamina. Thank
yeah.
you.
No, I like this. I don't remember. I like that question. I think the point that Renata makes in that review, which I think is a very good one, is that it's that people really shouldn't be professional critics, because what she says is it's very difficult to respond to every text as if it is a crisis. And
Hmm.
what she means by that is that if you are an occasional critic, you respond to work that prompts you to need to say something,
Hmm.
and as opposed to responding to the professional or calendar imperative of just coughing out 1,500 words on why something is good or bad,
Sure.
um,
Yep.
which is hard to do, honestly, because a lot of the time you just don't care. I mean, I see a lot of things or read a lot of things where I think, well, it's good, it's not good. Do I really feel impelled to say something about it? Not really.
Hmm.
Not for any reason other than someone might pay me to do it.
Right.
But yes, the question, what do people want from the movies? That's a large question.
It is. Well, we probably don't have enough time to really get into it, but while you're ruminating on it, I want to let our viewers know that we still have about 10 minutes left in the program. If you want to start sending your questions in, please do so, and Matthew and I will address them shortly. So, can you give us a sort of I don't want you to be glib,
Yeah.
but is it possible to what's this idea of the crisis though that you think we're hungering for?
Well,
You touch on it in the
do I
book.
say that we're hungering for the I mean, I do think, yes, I do think that we are. I touch on that at different points in the book. I think there might be something in the McGuane section where I talk about how we're always looking to risk something of ourselves. I mean, this is why people engage in all kinds of reckless behaviors, right? I mean,
Mhm.
small or large scale, right? People gamble, they ski, they surf, they hang glide, they have affairs, they do, it's a we do these things that are, risky. And I think there is a human impulse. This might be a little kind of divorced from the movies, but maybe not. Um, there's a human impulse towards gambling and towards risk that I think appears in this book very many different ways.
I think you do a really good job of articulating the unconscious pull toward self-destruction that particularly a lot of artists have.
Yeah,
It's one of the things that has stayed with me the most since reading your book a few months back.
yeah,
Um, we have a question.
yeah.
What is your favorite Joan Didion screenplay?
Yeah, I like that question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, you know what? I'm certainly a fan of Panic in Needle Park. As
Mhm.
first best. Um, I and I still think maybe that's the best. Even though I mean, it's hard to argue that the movie comes out quite as well. But I have a strange affection too for Up Close and Personal, which
Mm.
and there are personal reasons for that. In that I think it's a family friend, a personal friend who directed it, John Avnet, and I think he
Mhm.
did a lovely job with it. And also because I think that the story that it's telling, which is predicated, I think, loosely on Jessica Savage, an anchor named Jessica Savage, is one that my mom also grappled with. In fact, beforehand, she had been hired to write a script, and she did write a script
Mhm.
about a sort of troubled female news anchor that was also based on Jessica Savage. I think that the Didion Duns and Mr. Avnet did a better and certainly more successful version of it. My mom's version never got made, but I like that.
Oh, interesting. And of course, Pfeiffer and Redford have great chemistry.
Yeah, they do.
Um, toward the end of your book, you write that Adler's book offers a morality that prods gently at the abscess of the self. That's another one of the really striking lines. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to remember the context for the line.
I guess it was towards the end when you were discussing
It-
at the end
it-
of Adler's section.
and she's talking, I think, oh yes, when I'm talking about Pitch Dark. Um, I think that the thing that I take away from Adler's work, from Renauta's work, is it is so there's a kind of moral precision to it, and I think even that I talk about this when I talk about the Kale review, where people perceive it as a takedown, whereas I see it as a kind of protracted argument against inflated language, and by which she means in that case inflated critical language. There's a passage in Speedboat where she does this wonderful thing where she talks about how the adjectives of the season were visceral, so that movies and books were described as eye popping, bone crunching, tooth rattling, and how the kind of violence of this figuration, she was like, what does that do? What about things that are merely, lightly bruising or scraping, or like, like when you start exaggerating your language, your critical language, your moral language and your moral grammar starts to deteriorate or can deteriorate with it. And that being kind of scrupulously accurate with language is a way of sort of maintaining an ethical relationship to reality.
I like that idea. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do too, I think. And I think
great
now,
sentiment.
more than ever, we're obviously at a moment of great crisis. And it's nice to know that the work that you do is the work that one does is that it has value even beyond its kind of overt political content.
Final question is going to come from one of our viewers. It was a question I was going to ask you actually anyway. Can you tell us about upcoming projects or what you're working on now?
Yes, I am writing a long form. I guess I still have to call it a memoir, even though there's so much more to it than that. With the working title of it is The Golden Hour. It is due sooner than I would like to Echo Press. But it'll probably take me a little longer actually to finish it. But it's a story about kind of how the movies changed American consciousness, and vice versa, how American consciousness kind of fed itself back into the movies over the span of the last 75 years or so, and ultimately, in a sense, how the movies perished and moved from the center of American life to the margins where I think they are now. I mean, I think kind of the cultural conversation does not revolve. I mean, there exists a conversation about movies, but I think it's much more about television has kind of supplanted that as or streaming, right? But so it's and it's both centered around my family. I mean, it's in many ways, I think, even a more intimate and personal book than Always Crashing, but it's also about and narrated from the perspective of various people around them. And those people might range from, Lew Wasserman to Ward Beatty to members of the Black Panthers to, lots of people. It encompasses a lot of things that are not merely the movies.
Right. That's Echo Press. When will that? Yeah. You're still working on that, so
I'm writing it, but it'll be. My hope is that that it'll be in pretty good shape by the end of the year. So, yeah.
The book is Always Crashing in the Same Car: On Art, Crisis in Los Angeles, California, by Matthew Spector. Matthew, thank you so much for this, and thank you so much for your excellent book.
Really, thank you so much. It was great.
Real pleasure.
Great.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.
Thanks, Brian.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Matthew.